Everybody.
Okay, you are all set. Please take it away.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you all for your patience. I am so mortified about last month, and I would love to sit here and spin some incredible tale about what drew me away from you last month. But the plain truth of it is that I forgot. And while that may, burnish my credentials as the sort of bumbling, absent-minded professor type, it really does nothing to compensate you for your time lost. And so please, I'm very, very apologetic about last month, but so glad that we could jump right back on again here in November and spend this morning together talking about something that, as Lynn mentioned, I've been thinking about a lot over a lot of years, and that is these interactions and these common, in this case, garden wonders that are all around us, buzzing away and growing away, and that really deserve our attention as much as we can spare. And I'm particularly pleased that we are talking about gardening because I come from a long tradition in my family of island gardening. Of course, my wife is an avid gardener and also runs the Salish Seeds Project for native plants. My mother was a gardener on Orcas. My great-grandparents had a wonderful garden there on Orcas as well. So even though my thumb is not as green as some, it certainly runs in the family. And I'm particularly also fascinated by gardening and by all of these sorts of backyard activities, because even though in biology and in conservation we spend much of our time in wilderness areas or national parks and conservation areas and nature reserves and so forth, the vast majority of the interactions between people and nature take place close to home. So there's so much that we can see when we open our eyes to what's happening right there in our backyards. So as a biologist and an author, yes, I spend a lot of time focused on plants and animals, but I also spend a lot of time thinking about people, perhaps more than you might expect, because really the goal that runs through all of my writing and speaking and other activities is not just to learn about nature, but to help us all connect with it more in our daily lives. So I am then fascinated by these natural objects that somehow transcend the artificial but very significant barrier that we erect between the human world and the natural world. Things like seeds or bees that are so common in our daily lives and that have all of these fascinating stories to tell us when we pause and take the time to investigate. All of these stories about biology and about interactions in nature, about ecology, about evolution, and all of our connections to these things, not only in daily life, but throughout human history. So what I want to do today is tell you several stories that draw on the work that I've done and the writing that I've done on seeds and on bees. I've also worked on other things. We'll touch a bit on climate change today. I've also written a book about feathers, and I think there's an argument to be made that birds are common in the garden too, and quite wonderful. But I realized that if we included birds with the seeds and the bees, we'd be very close to a 1950s pop song sort of motif, the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees. So I decided we would stay on track with just the seeds and the bees this morning. But if you have questions when we get to the Q&A period about other things, birds or climate change or other aspects of my work, feel free. I'm open to questions on anything. So now, as we get started, I want to do a trick with you here that I learned from my sister-in-law, who is a middle school teacher and knows more about Zoom than all of us put together. And that is to share a portion of my screen. And if I do that, and we're all fortunate, you should be seeing a slide for our show this morning. Is everyone seeing that? I wonder if someone could give me a heads up.
Yeah, yes, we're seeing that.
I see a thumbs up. Okay, good. So we're on track with that, which is excellent. Now, the first story that I want to tell you has to do with seeds. And I have to say that when I embarked upon the seed book and the seed project, my wife made an interesting observation. She said, you know, my first book had been about mountain gorillas, and then I'd written one about feathers, and now I was moving on to seeds. And she told me, she said, you know, your topics keep getting smaller. What's next? Dust motes? You know, and fair enough. It's a fair enough observation. But if I've learned anything along the way, it's that the size of a natural wonder has no bearing whatsoever upon its importance or upon the remarkable stories that it has to tell us. Now, consider one of the most basic seed characteristics of all: endurance. The ability of a seed to lie dormant in the soil for months or years, even decades before sprouting. Now, as gardeners, we all take it for granted that a packet of seeds can be stored through the winter and planted in the spring. Or as members of society, we rely upon the fact that grains like wheat and corn and rice can sit around for long periods in silos and warehouses and pantries without spoiling. Our farming and food systems depend upon dormancy, but biologically, that seed trait remains quite mysterious. How does a baby plant enter what amounts to a state of suspended animation and then spring to life again when the time is right? Experts still aren't sure how it works, but it appears to have something to do with a substance called bioglass. Now, we know that truly dormant seeds are desiccated. They dry out until each individual cell loses 85, 90, even 95% of its water. And what's left inside those cells, the nucleus and the various organelles that make a cell function, becomes encased in this sugar-based glass-like substance that somehow preserves not only form and function, but also a memory of arrangement, so that when the cell is flooded with water again at the point of germination, everything takes its proper place and starts working as if no time had passed at all. Now, don't try this at home with your cells. When you desiccate human cells, you get a mummy. But seeds can do it. Seeds can do it. And even though we don't quite understand how it works, scientists have already begun using this property in other contexts. The world's first dry vaccines, for example, which are for use in places beyond the reach of ready refrigeration, have been developed by suspending live measles vaccine in a form of myo-inositol, which is a natural sugar extracted from inside of various legumes, inside of nuts, and inside of rice. And like the seeds that inspired them, these cutting-edge drugs really can remain viable, totally desiccated, and ready to travel for months on end. But of course, as any gardener knows, some seeds can last a lot longer than that. In those seed packets that it's sort of off season for gardening now, but if your household is like mine, the seed catalogs have already started arriving for next year. So we know that seeds can last a lot longer, which invites an obvious question, and that is, how long can a dormant seed survive? So the answer to that question is an incredible story. And it comes to us from a place called Masada. And in case you missed the Peter O'Toole miniseries from the early 1980s, Masada is an ancient fortress at the top of a rocky crag on the shores of the Dead Sea. Now, it was once the site of a famous siege in the waning days of the Great Revolt, when a band of Jewish rebels held out for months against a full Roman legion. And when the Romans finally breached those high walls, they built a ramp all the way up to the top of the cliffs. And when they breached the walls and got through, they were met not with battle cries, but with an eerie silence. And that is because all of the rebels had committed mass suicide rather than surrender to the Romans. So this is an important cultural site in modern day Israel. And as such, it was thoroughly excavated in the 1960s. During that dig, they found weapons, they found coins, they found storehouses full of food, including a trove of dates that were so well preserved in that dry desert air that bits of the date fruit itself, the flesh, was still clinging to the pits. And this was particularly significant because these were Judean dates, a variety famous throughout the ancient world. They're mentioned in the Bible. They were favored by the Emperor Augustus, and they were the cash crop of King Herod's kingdom. Yet they had disappeared. People stopped growing them not long after the fall of Judea. So that variety of date had, for all intents and purposes, gone extinct. So this was an exciting find, and being good archaeologists, they put numbers on all these little date pits and they put them in a drawer in a museum in Tel Aviv. But a few years ago, some botanists got a hold of a few of these ancient pits, and they planted them. And lo and behold, if one of those seeds didn't sprout and grow into a healthy Judean date palm after 2,000 years buried in the rubble at Masada. Now, they named him Methuselah, and it is a him. The sexes are separate in date palms. And they gave him his own little compound, as you can see here on the kibbutz in southern Israel. And then they madly started trying to get a female seed to sprout so they could resurrect this biblical fruit. And finally, after years of effort, they succeeded. Late last year, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, there was a harvest, in fact, of Judean dates. And it turns out they were indeed delicious, which was a great relief to the scientists who had been working on this project then for nearly a decade. They would have felt a bit foolish if they brought back these ancient fruits and they'd been terrible, but in fact, they were delicious. So what a symbol then of endurance and of mystery. And Methuselah is hardly the only amazing seed out there. The director of our national seed bank, which is located in Fort Collins, Colorado, Chris Shields, knows more about dormant seeds than just about anyone. And, after all, she's taking care of over 2 billion of them right there in the seed bank. And she told me when I visited years ago, she told me something remarkable that I wrote down. She told me that a dormant seed has no measurable metabolic activity. Now, in biology, we have a word for things with no metabolism. We call them dead. And I told that to Chris, and she told me this. She said, if we know of living things that aren't metabolizing, then maybe we need to change our definition of what it means to be alive. So the biology of a common garden wonder like a seed can challenge our very notion of life itself. And dormancy is just one of their fascinating traits. Now, I could sit here for the rest of our time this morning and rattle off more seed facts, but I think that I will end the seed portion of our discussion with a wonderful quote from George Bernard Shaw, who really captured the essence of seeds, I think, in 1918, when he wrote, "Think of the fierce energy concentrated in an acorn. You bury it in the ground and it explodes into a giant oak. Bury a sheep and nothing happens but decay." Now, bees, of course, are another essential garden wonder. They have been on my mind for a long time, in part because of a story that I heard years ago, and one that I think says so much about the human relationship to nature. Now, in the mid-1990s, I worked on a mountain gorilla project in a place called Bwindi Impenetrable Forest in southwestern Uganda. And since then, by the way, I have learned that people will actually get quite angry with me if I don't include at least one picture of a baby gorilla in every slide presentation. So here is this morning's baby gorilla. Now, the job that I had there involved a lot of trekking in hot weather, following gorillas through the rainforest. And we were often set upon in that work by hordes of these tiny flies. At least I thought they were flies until I bothered to look closely, and I realized that these were actually tiny jet black bees, no larger than a pencil point. And they were attracted to the moisture and the salts and so forth, and the sweat upon our skin. Tiny little stingless bees, these gentle creatures, totally harmless and quite wonderful. Well, a graduate student from Makerere University in Kampala, the capital there in Uganda, named Vincent, came down to study these things for his master's thesis. And after a couple of weeks, this guy was tearing his hair out. He could see his whole thesis sort of fizzling in front of his eyes because he had been hiking through the forest. And all that time, he had not been able to locate a single nest of these bees. You could see the bees in the air flying around. They would come and visit, the sweat on his skin, but he could never find their nests. And that was essential to his project. So the local trackers that I worked with suggested to Vincent that he hire a guide for a day, a member of the Batwa tribe, a group of hunter-gatherers that until quite recently had called that forest home. So he took their advice, and he and a local Batwa man set off for a day into the forest. And Vincent told me later that what they did was, come to a little clearing in the woods and sit down next to some flowers. And they waited. And they waited. And he said, just when he thought, what am I paying this guy for? Finally, a bee shows up. There she goes. A bee shows up and futzes around on this flower for a moment or two, and then it flies off again. And they wait, and they see another bee, and they wait, and they see another bee. And this goes on over and over again, till finally the man stands up. He said, we go. And he sets off into the forest again, Vincent following along behind through the thick vegetation, walking very briskly until finally the man slows down and he starts looking. And within a moment or two, he points to this rotten stump, and there's a little hole with the bees coming in and out. How did he do it? Well, he knew what kinds of flowers that these stingless bees like to visit. So he knew where to sit and wait. And he watched the bees' trajectory, right? So he knew what direction that he needed to go. And he got a feeling for how long it took those bees to make a round trip, because he'd watched them go back and forth a number of times. And since everybody knows how fast a stingless bee flies, that gave him an idea of the distance. So they walked in the right direction for the right amount of time, slowed down, looked around. And since he knew that that species of bee nested in rotten stumps and logs, it didn't take him long at all to find the nest. Tracking bees through a jungle. Ever since, that has been my benchmark goal as a naturalist, something that I will never achieve. But in a very real sense, that is our history. As a species, we have a lot more tracking in our blood than texting. So for all of us, I believe that learning about nature is not just an exploration, but also an act of remembrance. And remembering bees is particularly important these days. We have all seen the headlines about honeybee colonies collapsing en masse and the widespread declines of many bumblebee species and other wild bees. But in reading those stories, I've also noticed something else, a certain, I don't know, mushiness, really, about the subject matter. I mean, what do we really know of bees? Even the experts often stumble over the details. Once, while I was listening to the radio in this car, as a matter of fact, you'll see that I have taken the island option of parking behind our local library to get a good internet connection this morning. Driving along, though, in the car, listening to the radio, I believe it was National Public Radio, the source of all knowledge, when they were interviewing a noted historian of science who said this. He said that when the settlers arrived in North America at Jamestown and Plymouth and so on, they brought honeybees with them from Europe, which is true. The domestic honeybee is a European and African species, not native to North America. But then he said that if they hadn't, there would have been nothing here to pollinate their crops. At which point I nearly drove off the road into Harrow Strait. Nothing to pollinate their crops. What about the 4,000 species of native bees already buzzing happily around North America? But that's not the worst of it. Now, given my interests, it won't surprise you to learn that I keep a copy of the book Bees of the World in my office. It's a nice reference book, hardbound edition with a lovely color photograph on the cover of the book. beautiful photograph, close up photograph, if you will, of a fly. A fly on the cover of Bees of the World. I just couldn't believe it. So here in the 21st century, we find ourselves in this peculiar position of being more familiar with the plight of bees than we are with the bees themselves, which means that the place to start in any exploration of bees is really the most basic question of all. What is a bee? Now, happily, I can share with you an answer to that question that is memorable and simple, and that really does sum up all the steps, the key steps of bee evolution. A bee is a hippie wasp. A bee is a hippie wasp. So the first thing to know is that wasps came first. They had been buzzing around happily upon this planet for millions of years before bees came along. Bees evolved from the wasps, and they still look an awful lot like them, which
Thor
is
Hanson, this is the Lopez.
oh yeah. Oh, I heard someone talking there. I guess we're still on. At any rate, so they evolved from the wasps. The wasps had been buzzing around happily. Bees evolved from them, and they still look quite a lot like them, which is why the two groups are so often confused for one another. But if you ever find yourself being harassed at a picnic the way these poor folks are, and you notice that your attackers are making a beeline, if you will, for the roast beef or the bologna in your sandwiches, in that case, then do not blame bees. Your attackers are certainly wasps, because wasps are hunters and scavengers, constantly out searching the landscape for insects or spiders or scraps of flesh that they can take home to feed to their larvae back at the nest. But bees gave up that lifestyle. They stopped eating meat altogether, and they began to provision themselves and their offspring solely from the products of flowers. And that dietary switch set them apart, and soon their behavior and even their bodies began to change as a result. They evolved these long tube-like tongues for sipping nectar from flowers, and they evolved these interesting feather-like branched hairs on their bodies, specifically adapted to carrying pollen grains from the flowers back home to the nest. Now, of course, there is nuance to the story. There are some bees that are parasitic and don't bother collecting pollen at all. And there are, of course, plenty of wasps out there that are happy enough to stop by a flower now and then for a sip of nectar. But if you want to remember the basics of bee evolution, you just remember this. They are the long-haired, flower-loving vegetarians, the hippie wasps. Now, all of this evolutionary activity took place quite a long time ago. Bees have been with us for at least 120 million years, since the middle of the Cretaceous period, which was an age on this planet famously dominated by the dinosaurs that you can see here. But if you can look past those lumbering beasts for a moment, there they go, to the vegetation in that picture, you will see something interesting. Ferns and conifers abound, but where are the flowers? You have to look pretty closely in a picture like this to find a couple of crummy-looking shrubs next to that triceratops that might bear a flower now and then. So it's not exactly a promising landscape for the evolution of insects that rely upon flowers and nectar exclusively to make a living. But the artist who sketched this picture was spot on, because in the mid-Cretaceous, flowering plants were a rarity. They were bit players in a flora still dominated by cycads and ginkgos and other early seed plants. In fact, the sudden rise of the flowering plants during the latter part of the Cretaceous was long considered wholly inexplicable, a strange and sudden transition that was clearly visible in the fossil record. No flowering plants, and then suddenly, boom, there they are, and they're everywhere, and they're diverse. Charles Darwin called this an abominable mystery, and he considered it a serious challenge to his concept of evolution as a slow process of incremental change. Rarely noted, however, is that in the same letter where Darwin made that famous mystery comment, he mentioned his correspondence with a lesser-known naturalist of the day, a Frenchman named Gaston de Saporta, who theorized that flowering plants did indeed evolve rapidly. And they did so as a result of their interactions with flower-visiting insects, particularly the bees. Darwin didn't buy it. He didn't buy it. He preferred to think that flowering plants must have evolved slowly somewhere else and then dispersed rapidly to the places where they became fossilized. Well, Darwin had a bigger reputation as well as a bigger beard. And that meant something, I think, in Victorian times. And it would be decades really before people realized that old Saporta had been right all along. Coevolution with insects, particularly the bees, did indeed help drive the rapid evolution of flowering plants. And the results can be seen in your garden. They can be seen in mountain meadows and jungles and nearest flower markets. An incredible diversity of forms in the flowers. But what is less well known is how the rapid diversification of flowering plants led in turn to an incredible diversity of bees, which range from the familiar, like this bumblebee, to the fantastic, like this iridescent sweat bee, a species, by the way, which you can see in your backyard right there on Lopez Island. Agapostemon is the genus. Love these creatures. So they're fantastic creatures like this Agapostemon. They can be downright bizarre, like this long-tongued specimen known only from the Atacama deserts in Chile. They can be minuscule, like this little cuckoo bee glued to the side of a pin, or they can be massive, like this bulky oil-collecting bee from Puerto Rico. And their colors are incredible, ranging from simple, like this marvelous little leafcutter bee, to quite showy, like the red on the back of this bee, or this wonderful blue banded bee from Australia, or consider this, a fantastic purple euglossine bee from French Guiana. And while it's true that many bees are indeed fuzzy, like this longhorned specimen, they can also be smooth, like this blood bee, or shimmering, like this orchid bee from South America. And while some bees may seem alarming, or at least certain parts of them might seem alarming, they can also be, in spite of their antennae and their faceted eyes, what can only be described as cute. So the coevolution of bees and flowering plants has led to great diversity on both sides of the equation. A full 20,000 bees can be found buzzing around this planet, more than all of the birds and the mammals. You can even throw in the reptiles, all of them put together, more than all of them. And only a tiny fraction of those bees have ever been studied in detail. Perhaps thousands of species are yet to be discovered. It is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that sitting here this morning in San Juan County, within 100 miles of numerous research universities, it's a well-studied landscape by any measure. We are probably within a few miles of a bee unknown to science. How thrilling. Now, if I were giving this presentation to you 100 years ago, I could stop now and take questions. Even 50 years ago, I might not have needed to say another word. But in the 21st century, it is impossible to talk about these natural wonders in our gardens and yards or in the wilderness anywhere on this planet without confronting the challenges that they face. Because just as many bee species are in decline, so too are, in some cases, the relationships that bind plants and bees together in the first place. Consider this wonderful relationship captured in this picture taken here on San Juan Island. The flower you may recognize as death camas, and the bee you may not recognize, but you will remember its name forever. This is the death camas bee, very appropriately named. And as we all know, death camas is, living up to its name through the production of a suite of chemicals, including zygosine, this particularly nasty stuff that attacks the heart, attacks the nervous system, it attacks your digestion. It is indeed deadly poisonous. And unlike many plants that concentrate their poisons and toxins in places that are likely to be nibbled by herbivores, or they put them in the seeds to protect them from nibbling via rodents and so forth, the death camas plant puts this stuff everywhere, including into its pollen and nectar, which means that in terms of pollination, it's in a bit of a fix. I mean, how do you lure in potential pollinators when instead of a tasty, sweet, nutritious treat, you are offering them paralysis and death? So enter the wonderful death camas bee, which is one of very few insects and the only bee species that has figured out a way to either tolerate or detoxify zygosine. And this tightly then co-evolved relationship between the plant and the bee benefits both sides, in that the bee has an exclusive or nearly exclusive source of pollen and nectar all to itself out there in our wildflower meadows here in the islands. Whereas the plant then has this very dedicated pollinator that is going to be visiting its flowers intensely throughout its flowering period until you enter into this equation, the process of climate change. And you start to warm the spring times earlier and earlier as the planet's temperature overall begins to rise. We can see springtime happening earlier all around us, in your gardens, but also in the wild places here in the islands and all over the northern and southern hemispheres. So that one of the most common reactions in terms of plant life is to respond by flowering earlier in the spring. If they're temperature dependent flowering times, then many plants are responding by flowering earlier. Death camas, no different than those. It now flowers 2 weeks earlier here in the San Juan Islands than it did just 30 years ago. We know that from the meticulous records kept by the naturalists and stewards of Yellow Island out in Wasp Passage there. And we can see that death camas blooming earlier and earlier, responding to the warming air temperatures. The bees, on the other hand, nest in the ground, where temperatures are warming much more slowly, and they are still on the old schedule. And so what you see happening then is the flowers blooming too early for their bees, and the bees emerging later and later in relationship to the flowers, threatening, if this trend continues, to tear apart this co-evolved relationship, separating these two species, not in space, they're still in the same landscape, separating them in time. One of the risks and one of the reasons that we worry particularly about specialist pollinator relationships on a warming planet, because if you change the timing, you change the whole relationship. So these threats that we see around us now to our backyard and garden wonders and to ecosystems everywhere are real, and they are daunting. And I believe that makes it all the more vital for us to reconnect with nature in everyday life, because our resolve gains strength really through the wonder that we feel for these things. We are stronger when we can meet such challenges from the standpoint not of despair, but of fascination and curiosity. So I would like to conclude this morning before we turn to questions, and I hope you have some burning questions this morning that I can perhaps help you with. I'd like to conclude by reading a short passage from the preface to the bee book, Buzz, which is, I think, appropriate to start from the beginning, because while we have learned a lot about these things, we're still really only at the beginning of understanding what we can do to help them. So I always like to end at the start. This then from the preface to Buzz, which begins with an epigraph, a quotation from Henry David Thoreau, who wrote these wonderful words: "There are certain pursuits which, if not wholly poetic and true, do at least suggest a nobler and finer relation to nature than we know. The keeping of bees, for instance, is like directing the sunbeams." Bees today certainly need our help, but just as importantly, they need our curiosity. Exploring the history and biology of these essential creatures can transform anyone into an enthusiast. And that is the purpose of this book. But I hope that you will do more than read it. I hope it makes you want to go straight outside on the next sunny day and find a bee on a flower and settle down to watch. If you do, you might just find yourself daring to reach out and catch the bee the same way my young son has done since the age of 3, barehanded. Try this, and you too can feel the tickle of tiny feet and the whispery rustle of wings on your palm before you slowly part your fingers, hold the bee up, and let it go. So thank you all very much for your attention. I think now we've saved some time for questions and answers. I will stop the screen share and am happy to entertain any questions.
Does anybody in the audience here in the center have questions? And we're going to ask folks to use the microphone so that everybody on the Zoom will hear.
I think they're going to try to can this is looking fine. So, well, I have a question. Is a yellow jacket a bee or a wasp?
Yellow jackets. You know, there is a wonderful scientist at the American Museum of Natural History. He's one of their chief insect curators, and he is a specialist on social wasps. Like yellow jackets, they are in fact social wasps. And I saw him give a lecture once, and he started off his lecture by saying, "Nobody likes a social wasp." And here's the world expert on social wasps admitting it right off the bat. So yellow jackets are wasps, and they do resemble bees. And in fact, when people say they've been stung by a bee, oh boy, quite a lot of the time it's a wasp that was really responsible. And there's a reason really why you see such aggression in these highly social creatures like wasps. Like the social wasps, like the yellow jackets, and we have several species of them here. The ones that make the football-sized nests up in the trees and the rafters, and the ones that nest in the ground, and so on and so forth. And the reason is this: that highly social behavior has a tendency to concentrate large amounts of food and larvae and so forth in those nests. So social wasps have a lot to defend, right? And so they have developed then this behavior of stinging and stinging in mass to defend these large concentrations of resources. And if you look at the bees, the same thing is really true in the bee world. The ones that do sting, if you're going to get stung by a bee, tend to be the highly social species, the honeybees or the bumblebees. But beyond that, not so much. And it really makes sense when you think about their biology and their behavior, in that the vast majority of bees are solitary creatures. They nest, in holes in wood or in the ends of twigs, or they nest in holes in the ground. And the whole story of the nest is a single female who is laying eggs and provisioning little cells for 5 or 6 offspring, and then sealing the thing up and moving on and trying to do it again before she runs out of energy and flowers and so forth. And so in that situation, then, when she feels threatened, the easiest thing to do is to get out of there, to flee, rather than to bother defending what is a very small nest in that situation. So you have a very different drive from an evolutionary standpoint between creatures that have amassed huge amounts of honey and larvae and so forth, or for the social wasps, it's full of all the meat and the provision cells full of developing little wasp larvae. They have a real reason to defend that, and they've developed these behaviors that go along with it, including increased aggression. So the yellow jackets, the ones that disturb you at a picnic or when you're out on the deck in the summer trying to enjoy a barbecue and a glass of wine, almost certainly yellow jackets of in the family Vespidae, and there are several. We have Vespula and Dolichovespula are the two big genera of yellow jackets here in the islands.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have a question about, I'm sorry, I joined a little bit late, but if there is a good field guide that is available for bee identification, especially more locally on the West Coast or in the Pacific Northwest, I take pictures and then I go on the internet and try to figure out what bee that was, but it would be great if there was a good ID book.
Yeah,
Maybe.
great. That's a great question. There are several resources. Let me think of, for bumblebees, there's a marvelous book that's free on the internet put together by the U.S. Forest Service called Bumblebees of the West, I think, but it's a Forest Service publication. Jamie Strange is one of the authors of that. So if you look that up, by the way, this is a total aside, but this is, so Jamie Strange, great bumblebee expert. There's another wonderful entomologist who lives here in the state of Washington, whose name is Chris Looney. These guys are friends and they often work together. You've probably met Chris. He comes up to the island and gives lectures and so forth. And in science, we have this tradition of when you write a paper together, the paper, if it's being cited or referred to by others, is referred to by the last names of the authors. So I always love it when Jamie and Chris write a paper together, because then the paper is known as either Looney and Strange or Strange and Looney. Either way, it's a win. So look for Jamie Strange's Bumblebee book. There's also Bumblebees of North America, which is a larger volume, but I think the one for the West is better for you. Quiot there on Lopez has some online resources for local bees, including photographs. And there are a few other things to try. This new platform, well, not new, but it's been around for about 10 years, but it's really taking off now. And that is iNaturalist, allows you to upload a photograph and get it identified. And that can be quite useful. There's also a similar effort for bumblebees called Bumblebee Watch, run out of a group there in Oregon. And then there's also a good online reference called bugguide.net, another place where you can upload photographs. And I happen to know that John Asher, who really is one of the great bee taxonomists, spends an inordinate amount of his time volunteering for Bug Guide, and he goes through and identifies bees for people all the time. So if you see a bee on there identified by John Asher, you know the ID is correct, and it's a good way to get your bees ID'd. So those are some leads for you.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Hey, I was part of this when I was living on Lopez. I was part of Looney's, Chris Looney's study for 3 years with identifying local bees. So it was really fun. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thor, this is, well, it doesn't matter who I am. I've got a couple of questions. One is, do we need to be concerned about killer bees migrating to the San Juans? And what's your next book?
Oh, okay. So the killer bees. Yes, this is the story of the killer bees is a great story of a scientific blunder. What happened here, if you look at the honeybee, you have a huge range, natural range for honeybees from Europe all the way down through the continent of Africa. And there's several subspecies there. The ones that we are most familiar with are a sort of European and Mediterranean subspecies, one of the most docile that's been domesticated, and that characteristic has been encouraged. So even though beekeepers get stung, don't get me wrong, much less so than you might imagine. There is another subspecies of Apis mellifera down in the southern part of Africa, which is more aggressive, much more aggressive. Again, it's this defensive behavior, right? If you have a nest that's worthy of defense, you develop an aggressive behavior to defend it. And the bees there are known for accumulating large quantities of honey in the nest. And so the idea then, this is decades ago now, was to see if you could cross these two subspecies of the same species and breed a bee that would get the best characteristics of both. A docile bee that would have this habit of gathering even larger amounts of honey. This seemed like a great idea, no brainer. And they were working on this in a lab in Brazil. And they had it all set up so that, the bees couldn't escape. And they had these little attachments on the hive that would prevent the queens, the pregnant queens, from getting out. And then some other scientist was going through there and said, well, what are all these little gizmos in the way? Pull them all out. And the queens got out of these hybrid bees, and they looked around Brazil and they said, hey man, this is great, we love it here. And then they looked over into neighboring countries and thought it looks super over here too. They like Central America, they like Mexico, and they like the southern parts of the United States. And so they've gotten all the way up into the desert Southwest and places like that. What seems to be stopping them are cold winter temperatures. So they have really slowed in their advance of coming north. And it's unlikely that if we continue to have, heavy frosts and so forth here, that we would get them in our neighborhood. So not a big worry for the killer bees making it this far north. Although, with warming, many things are moving north, but they've still got quite a ways to go. And that seems to be a barrier for them. And so then the other question, of course, what am I working on now? Well, I am, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, really, really interested in these, close to home experiences that we have with nature. I mean, national parks are fabulous, but we don't get them, we don't visit them very often. And yet we're outside in our neighborhoods, in our yards, and so on all the time. This is where most interactions between people and nature take place. And so I'm working on a book about backyard biology, which is examining what we can find close to home and how we can change our perspectives on seeing these familiar things so that we can open ourselves to those experiences in a different way. And then also how the advent of these, we were just talking about iNaturalist and Bug Guide and so on and so forth, how the advent of some of those tools through modern technology and so forth really are enabling these great collaborations between all of us here at home and scientists who need data, right? There is a lot of data in the world, but there are only so many biologists, it turns out. So all of us can help in that in really significant ways. And, if you look at a platform like iNaturalist, which started out as Kenichi Ueda's master's thesis at the University of California at Berkeley, a social platform for sharing images about nature, and has exploded into this incredible resource used now in 180 countries, translated into 83 languages. And if you see then what scientists are able to do with this collection of images being generated, because every one of those pictures that can be identified, whether it's your bee on Lopez Island or your banded rubber frog in Angola or whatever the hell it is, every one of those that can be identified is a date-stamped photograph. So you have then a place and a species and a time en masse. And it's allowing scientists then to ask and answer questions that you simply could never do on anyone's research budget, because you're getting these global data sets. And now it's over 3,000 scientific papers have cited data from iNaturalist alone, and there are other platforms that are doing the same thing. So these things are really changing not only the way that we can learn about nature, but the way that science is done. And one of my favorite facts about this, in chatting with some of these people who are working on these platforms, is that a lot of scientists using that data and gathering it now through big global databases, they don't even know that they're using data from a place like iNaturalist or eBird or whatever it is. They're just getting the data and using it, answering questions, which is a fabulous development in terms of the democratization of science, because it means then that the observations being made by amateurs have become a part of the scientific firmament. And I think that's really an exciting development. So this is the theme that I'm working on now, what we can do close to home, how we can see things differently, and how we can use our observations to help answer vital questions in biology and conservation.
Hey, Tor, this is Tracy. Can I have a question for you.
Of course.
This year, the central part of Lopez, where we live, had a huge tent caterpillar infestation everywhere. And other parts of the island had less, but I've always heard that with a large tent caterpillar population, there'll be a lot more yellow jackets or not. So there's a relationship between the two, but I'm not an expert. What do you know?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. So when you get these massive outbreaks, and we just had one here in south end of San Juan, where I am, a year ago, massive outbreak. Of course, that's a lot of food, isn't it? So what's going to eat all of that? Well, we don't have many birds that like tent caterpillars here. We really don't. A Baltimore Oriole will eat a tent caterpillar on the East Coast, but we don't have a lot of even any kind of Oriole here. So they're not favored. They've got all those hairs that are, semi-irritating, and not a lot of things eat them. You will see yellow jackets preying upon them occasionally, but so I don't know how firm that connection is. There is a relationship, though, that is absolutely firm, and you can see this next time you have an outbreak, or even a modest number of caterpillars if you look for it. And that is a relationship between tent caterpillars and a particular kind of tachinid fly, which is a parasitic species upon tent caterpillars specifically. It looks like, a little bit like a housefly on steroids. It looks like a housefly you'd meet in a dark alley. It's got some real, heft to the shoulders and real spiky hairs on it. Man, it's tough looking. So watch for those flies when you've got your tent caterpillars around, and then look closely at your tent caterpillars and look on their heads, on those black heads, and you're going to see these oblong white eggs that have been laid on the heads of the tent caterpillars. Occasionally you'll see one elsewhere on the body, but where they're really aiming for is the head. And the fly follows the caterpillars around, and you'll see these battles between flies and caterpillars, because the caterpillars know exactly what's going on, and they are trying to evade these flies. They'll be thrashing back and forth, and the fly will be darting in. And they lay those eggs upon the flies. The eggs hatch. The larva of the fly will burrow into the body of the caterpillar, consuming the caterpillar from the inside out as it develops. It is a gruesome tale. But if you have lost all of your fruit tree leaves to caterpillars, one that you will be cheering for the flies in your own way. Those fly larvae suddenly become really attractive to you. And in that regard, then you do see a relationship between the abundance of the caterpillars and the abundance of the flies. The flies do play a role in helping to keep down caterpillar populations when you have those massive outbreaks. So I don't know specifically if you really see it with the yellow jackets. I do see them hunting the caterpillars, although not nearly as much so as you do with this fly. That is clear as day. And you'll see it when you get out and look. You don't even need to find the fly. Just look at your caterpillars. And if you see a whole bunch of white eggs on the heads, you know you've got your flies around.
Thor, as gardeners, of course, our main question always is, well, what can we plant to help our bees or other insects, native plants, of course, but do you have something in particular that maybe is lacking that we need to pay more attention to?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So in terms of planting for bees, a diversity of plants, well, one of the pleasures of planting for bees is that they have similar tastes to us in a sense. Not only, I mean, they eat honey, we eat honey. It sounds, it's great. We like that. But they have a similar aesthetic as well, in that they're attracted to colorful flowers, and they want flowers that last over the course of a season. So when you're planning for bees, it's much like planting a flower garden that you want to enjoy yourself, because you want to have your spring bloomers, you want to have your summer bloomers, you want late summer and even into the fall, the things that last through that whole season. And the bees are looking for the same thing. They want sources of nectar and pollen throughout. So that's the first theme to keep in mind. A second would be to look for as many natives as you can fit in. There are certainly many bees that will use even something like, a catmint or what have you. They're not, some species are not picky. You'll see bumblebees on all kinds of stuff, and honeybees and so forth. But for many of the natives, they're really looking for specific species or specific local groups of species. So even regional natives will enhance the diversity of bees in your flower garden at any time of year. So as many natives as you can squeeze in when you can find them. Of course, no pesticides and all that. That really does spoil things. And then the third aspect is to think about a complete bee habitat. And by that, I mean not just the moment of seeing a bee on a flower, but what else does that bee need to make it through its full life cycle, right? It doesn't just need flowers, it's got to have a place to nest. And so you want to start thinking about how your yard and garden can encourage bees throughout their whole life. And so you might consider then some of these, tubes and so forth that allow some of the tube nesting bees like mason bees, of which there are many native, local species. It's not just the orchard mason bee, which is a lovely bee, but there are dozens of different mason bees that will use tubes or reeds and so forth. And then the best part about this is that it allows one to avoid yard work for a good cause. Not just because you'd rather be taking a hike or going fishing or something, but you can avoid the yard work in terms of favoring your bees because they like to have stuff. They want to have stuff around on the ground. They want old twigs and reeds and things that are lying around that they might nest in. They want piles of leaves here and there that they might burrow under to spend the winter. They want, a little bit of untidiness is a really good thing in a garden. So if you do those things, you get flowers all throughout the season, and you look for as many natives local or regional natives as you can find, and then leave it a bit messy, you're going to have a lot more bees. And it's instant gratification, by the way. This is one of those rare times in conservation, when you can make a change and see something happen quickly. When you do those sorts of things, the bees will find those resources in your yard and they will use them.
I have a question. When you say you'll have more bees, what's the typical range of a bee that would live in your yard or your neighbor's yard?
Wow, wonderful question. It's variable. It's variable because the bees themselves are so variable. You have bumblebees and honeybees, that some of these big burly ones and highly social ones that will travel, a mile from the nest for a good source of nectar or pollen. But then you have other bees, tiny little, ground nesting bees, little sweat bees and cuckoo bees and things that might live their whole lives right there in your yard. They don't need much space at all. So a great range. But when you do those things, you'll start to see that diversity in size and in color and in habit. And some of those will be really living in a very local area, just in your yard, your neighbor's yards, in very small spaces. They'll live their whole life cycle in that zone.
I had always heard that bumblebees don't sting, but sounds like maybe that's not right.
Oh, yeah, not right. No, you can get a good wallop from a bumblebee. They're reluctant to sting. They're quite patient. And again, when you see this stinging behavior, it's usually, if they're caught in your shirt or something and they panic, but usually you'll see it more intensely around a nest that they're trying to defend. So we tend to interact with bumblebees, on flowers when they're really focused on nectar and pollen and so forth, and they could care less. You can pet them and they just sort of lift a leg and, leave me alone, I'm busy. But you can get stung if you are, particularly if you're closer to a nest where they're feeling more defensive. Honeybees, of course, similar in that regard. The vast majority of our local bees, though, and there are scores of different species, are harmless little creatures, very reluctant to sting, even if you're pestering them, and they don't tend to defend their nests much at all. That, the severity of the sting, the biology of it, you really can see a clear relationship to the biology and ecology of the species involved. There's this great entomologist who is down in Arizona someplace who has put together the sting index, and he's been allowed himself to be stung by all sorts of creatures and has put together an index of which ones hurt the most and so on. And honeybees and bumblebees are right sort of in the middle, and then you've got some really scary wasps and hornets and things that are even worse, and bullet ants and all these hymenopterans. Nonetheless, you can see this relationship, and one of the most diabolical things is to look at the way that a honeybee stings, which is quite, it's different than a bumblebee or than any of the other bees that do sting in our fauna. Different also even from the wasps that sting, in that the honeybees are the only ones with those barbed stingers, right? And if you ever get a chance to see one of those up close under a microscope, it will give you nightmares, because it's not just the pointy barbed thing. It's a double-edged, like two little knife blades that have jagged edges on each side. Those are the barbs. And the knife, it goes like this, when it goes into your flesh. So it goes farther in and sticks there, right? So this is then the last act really for that individual female worker bee. When she stings, you brush her body off, and the barb is stuck and it tears free, and that is a mortal wound for the bee. She will perish in defense of the nest at that point. She will fly off and perish shortly thereafter, and leaving behind then this wicked little barb in your flesh, which isn't just the barb alone, but it's the barb that includes the venom sac still attached. But it's not just the barb and the venom sac. It also includes the muscles around the venom sac have also broken free, and a little nerve ending there that are telling those muscles to continue to contract and squeeze every drop of venom into that wound, even after the bee has been ripped free and perished. So it's a truly diabolical system that has evolved specifically to defend the great resources found within a honeybee nest. You won't see that a bumblebee is just a very much more simple lancet type thing, and can sting several times, and not perish. But for the honeybees, it truly is a diabolical system.
Thor, that's almost more than I wanted to hear.
Yeah, you're not the first person to tell me that.
Well, I asked about the killer bees, but what I think I mislabeled them. I was thinking about those bees that were found in Blaine, the murder hornets, I guess.
Yes.
Could they possibly come our way?
Yeah, so the murder hornets, or the what are they, giant Asian hornet, at any rate, those are a different story. Probably arrived in shipping containers or something into Vancouver, been seen in BC and on Vancouver Island, and then made it across into Whatcom County. And I believe that this year, I don't think they found any nests. So it's still an open question on whether they're getting established or not. But it is a risk, and there's something to watch out for. And the way that you are most likely to see one of these things would be if you have paper wasps nesting in the eaves of your house or your garden shed or whatever. And by paper wasps, I'm referring to not the enclosed yellow jacket nests that we were talking about earlier. And I'm talking about they look like a nest that nobody got around to finishing, right? They're open, the cells are visible, but you'll see these big paper wasps wandering around dully on there. That is the genus Polistes that makes those nests. And that particular, well, the common one here is a European Polistes that's very well established now. And they're quite docile. They don't usually sting. They will, but they don't usually sting. So the murder hornets, then, their biology and the reason they're so big is they have evolved to attack other social insects. And as we have been talking about, social wasps, social bees have a lot to defend, and they're the ones with the fierce stings. So if you want to be a specialist on attacking these things, you need to be big and tough to be able to resist those stings. And that's why those murder hornets, if you will, have grown over evolutionary time so large, and they have such tough cuticles that can resist the stinger and so forth. So their strategy then, late in the season, you'll only see this happening, in late summer and into the fall, when they begin to target social insects. And the most common one around here for them to target are those Polistes nests. So you would see your little Polistes with this massive hornet come in and start, destroying them and stealing the larvae out of the nest. That's probably the way so keep your eyes peeled on that, because, Chris Looney, for example, who was working on that project for the Department of Agriculture, would like to know if you see one. But that's how their strategy evolved. They're attacking those other social insects, again, because they're social themselves. And by that point in their season, they have a massive number of huge larvae that are hungry back at the nest that they're trying to feed. And so they attack other social insects, because if they can do away with all of those adult Polistes or do away with all of the adult honeybees, then they can take all of the resources from the nest back to their nest and use it to feed their own larvae. Early in the season, their nests are small. It's just a queen and a few workers, and they're just catching caterpillars and so on. That's plenty of food for a smaller nest. But late in the season, when they've established these huge nests, that's when they start targeting things like honeybees and paper wasps.
I have so enjoyed your presentation, but I want to say something about honeybees that I have observed, because when I lived in Appalachia, I, in my entire life, was enamored with bugs like you crawling around in my belly in Texas and seeing all sorts of varieties. You could do that a lot of days and a lot of hours in Texas. But I ended up in my lifetime journey in the Appalachian Mountains over by West Virginia, Western Maryland. And I was an absolutely impassioned honeybee keeper, because I knew we were losing the honeybees. But in all the literature, even the current literature, so I have two main issues about honeybees in general. Number one, how we take care of them. Because really, like you said, they kind of evolved on the earth at the time of the plant. So all of the pharmacopoeia that is wired into their DNA code is attached to the variety and species that they grew up with, just like what our lineage is if you do ancestry.com. Well, we are slowly killing all the native plants on the earth. And because I lived in Maryland and the Beltsville Bee Lab was just down the road and Penn State was just up north, and I had friends who lived in that area, and I was a university student myself. I'm not a biologist, I was a counselor, but during the time that I decided I wanted to go back and get my master's, I went out to Arizona and saw some honeybee hives and realized, if there's one thing every single individual could do to help the earth, would be to help the bees, the honeybees. Well, even currently, I read literature about new beekeepers and the information we pass down to them, and it's all based on some of the science out of Beltsville and Penn State. We've gone monoculture. We killed off the native plants. The practices for the beekeepers are to take all the honey off the hive, and in West Virginia, they will deliver 500 pounds of high fructose corn syrup where you can feed your bees all winter. Well, you know, if the bees are out working their entire lifetime to put together their protein powders, which is their medicine, and their nectar in the honey, which is also their medicine from the pharmacopoeia of God's great gift to the earth, the flowers, then how can we assume that we human beings are the causes, not all the diseases? Well, they're giving up. The honeybees are giving up to the diseases because what? They don't have good nutrition at all because the native plants are disappearing. And then number two, our practices of taking all the honey off to sell for our benefit while the bees have nothing to live on. So you can see I'm a little impassioned about this. The second issue that really drives me crazy is that people talk about, oh, well, smoke the honeybees, it makes them calm. No, it doesn't make them calm. Imagine a million years ago when the fires came and your hive, your family, your possessions, and every single thing is in that tree and it's caught on fire. Well, the honeybees don't have time to go attack the attackers. The honeybees are trying to suck up into their own bodies all of the food that they need to build a new little community somewhere else if they can fly beyond the fires. So they engorge themselves with the food so that they've got what they need to try to start over, maybe. And of course, their anatomy doesn't allow them to stereotype because they are full. How many bites do you want to get in after 5 Thanksgiving meals? You know, so all this stuff, you know, even out of the world of the scientists, well, you smoke the bees, it makes them calm. Well, let me ask you how you would react if your entire world is just going up in flames, your babies, your history, your DNA, your food, your house, everything. So if you have contact with ways that would bring a different kind of a viewing of the insects, the honeybees in particular, than in some lab or some controlled environment, you know, the wildlife people who are really there watching what's going on, and they have the perspective that it all is knitted together. It's all knitted together. We need the native plants. We need to stop taking the food from the honeybees and using them like they're some tractor, you know, for our farms, and stop measuring the beauty of nature with a dollar sign and capitalistic thought and mechanistic thought. We need to get back to the humanity where we know that we are part of something that is so complex that we gotta stop jimming with these little pieces. So I guess what I'm saying is a honeybee gives up her entire life to protect her community. When she's stinging, she's fighting for something. And so, you know, she'll die. So as a beekeeper, I tried never, ever, and I took it very slow, never to kill one little honeybee who has worked so hard to be here. So thank you for what you've said about the bees, and understand there are people like me in the world who are out there looking and caring. I have come to the Pacific Northwest from Appalachia. I'm not sure where my place is here yet, but I know one thing, that we all need to be advocates of the honeybees and all of the bees that exist here. We are the newcomers to this place. We are. And
Thank you for your comments. And you hit on a whole bunch of themes that really are important in terms of bee conservation. One of the threats to honeybees, but bees in general, is poor nutrition. And exactly what you pointed out, in that we have altered the way we manage land over the last, particularly 50, 60, 70 years, changing rural landscapes from a place of varied habitats where you had small farms with different crops and every farmhouse had a backyard orchard and garden and so on, which really provided quite a bit of habitat for bees. By switching that over to monocultures, you now have huge areas farmed from roadside to roadside without any hedgerows or anything. And it's very efficient. And if it's, a flowering plant, well, by God, for 2-3 weeks out of the year, there's all the food you want. And for the rest of the year, it's an absolute desert for bees and other insects. So we have seen then a real decline in insect habitat with the way we've begun managing land. And so I think, those sorts of ecological things that you can do to think about it, and in putting yourself as you have been in the place of the bee. What does it mean to the bee to see these changes and so on? I think is a really great way to remind ourselves how we can connect and empathize with honeybees, but also the native bees and all of these other insects that are using the same habitat in similar ways. Thank you again for your comments and your passion.
Thor, thank you so much. I think everyone enjoyed your presentation, and I appreciate you coming out and doing this from your car. It's pretty awesome.
No worries. It was really fun. Thank you for all the great questions. And it's nice to see you sort of all from here on this island. I hope you have a great day over on Lopez. And thanks once again for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Thor. And
We hope you heard all of our applause, Thor. Thank you.
Oh, sure thing. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.